Okay, this is Unit 1, Lesson 1, the Atlantic World, where we're going to compare how eventually the New World and the Old World unite. Today, we're going to look at 5 slides. You're going to listen, take notes, and then summarize your answer to each question in the assignment titled Atlantic World Slides Summary Classwork. It is due on the 24th. So the question for today, the main question, is why was Europe so violent and full of diseases in the 1400s? And this main question is based on 3 questions that you guys, my students, asked in your homework 2 days ago. One of those questions was, what was it that had caused Europe to be such a violent and competitive place that involved people who were actually willing to kill, torture, and exploit certain people? Another question was, why didn't the Europeans believe in equality? And a third question was, if diseases caused death to 90% of Amerindians and the old world had all these trade routes, why didn't they get sick or catch any diseases? So we're going to start with a small question. Why was the old world so full of diseases? And the short answer is animals. Farm animals, animals that live on farms, animals that people keep very close to them, animals like sheep and cows and goats and pigs. Animals like sheep and cows and goats and pigs who live on a farm with people, they spread their diseases from the cows to the people. We've heard of swine flu, but we've also heard of cowpox, which is related to the disease smallpox. And all these diseases were spread pretty easily to the humans who spent a lot of time with these animals. Also, if you spend any time around animals or farms that have these farms smell like poop. The animal feces that are dropped all over the farms are also a big vector for disease. Yet another reason that the old world was so full of diseases is that people were trading with each other across the old world. So the old world is Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this old world, or the entire world as far as the people in these places were concerned, was very connected to itself. These red lines represent the Silk Road. The blue lines represent Swahili traders from places like Mogadishu on the east coast of Africa trading with Asia. These green lines are the Trans-Arabian caravans on camels usually. These yellow lines are the Trans-Saharan caravans, also often on camels. And these purple lines represent a few of the trade routes in the Mediterranean, connecting places up in northern Europe by water to places down in southern Europe. And these trade routes also spread disease because as people moved on these routes, they took diseases with them. Sometimes they took animals with them. In the case of the Swahili traders, perhaps cows or goats were taken on boats from place to place. In the case of the Silk Road, often silk and fabric was a main product being traded, but the people carrying that silk would be traveling on donkeys or horses, and those animals would be carrying diseases, and the people themselves would be carrying diseases through their own bodies. We know how contagious diseases can be. Also, the other vectors are things like rats, which are pretty famous during the Black Death for spreading the plague. The rats themselves didn't spread the plague, but the fleas on the rats held the plague inside them and jumped onto people and bit them and spread the disease. And so through these trade routes and through a lot of contact with pretty cute animals, humans in all of these places got sick a lot. And lots of people died from smallpox and from the plague and from just the flu. But also from diseases that come from being around a lot of poop, a lot of feces, things like cholera, where if you're in a place where there's poop in the water and you drink the water, you're going to get sick pretty easily. What this means is that whatever Europeans didn't die from those diseases already had immunity to them. That brings us to Europe specifically. So here we're talking about the old world, which is Europe, Africa, and Asia. And now let's talk about just Europe and its special things. Europe was especially full of diseases because by and large, it was a continent that was colder than a lot of places in Africa and a lot of places in Asia. And so people kept their farm animals indoors for at least part of the year. And so you have a farmhouse like this drawing here, which is like a stereotypical drawing, but it still shows us some things that are accurate. Cows, chickens inside your house. In the winter, it would be too cold to leave your animals outside, especially at night, and so the animals are kept in the house with the humans. They try to keep the animals on one side of the room and the humans on the other, but if you've ever lived with chickens or any kind of animals like that, they go wherever they want to go. Also, it wouldn't be that much healthier to have the cow poop segregated to one side of the room. You're still living in a house that has amounts of animal excrement all the time. And people tried their best to keep their houses clean, but animals that are defecating all the time, it's going to be an endless job. This picture also is a little idealized. This would be a pretty well-off family because there's a bed in it. And a lot of families would not have beds. They would sleep directly on the floor. Or if you had a bed, it would be for the older members of the family and everyone else would sleep on the floor. The floor would be covered with rushes or with straw or something like that to kind of create a little bit of padding. But still, we're talking about people sleeping on the floor for much of their life. You want to have everything in one room because it gets cold in the winter. And if you have a separate building for the animals, they're going to get cold and maybe die. And firewood is really expensive back then. And so you want to be able to have one fire that cooks your food, heats your house, and keeps the animals alive. Another problem with this kind of lifestyle is the fact that people on farms had their animals in their houses and people in cities were living really, really close together. Some medieval villages and towns are still standing today. They're much cleaner now than they used to be because you got to imagine that there was no plumbing back then. There's no sinks, no running water, and no toilets. And so while people dumping literally human excrement out the window onto the street is probably not 100% true, it probably did happen occasionally. But going out your front door and dumping excrement in the street was pretty common. Also, since you don't have running water, you're going to need to go out of your house and walk down the little lane to a well to get water for your household in a bucket. And that's going to mean that it's very rare for people to bathe. If you have to bring back enough water to your house for all of your household to drink and eat and cook, you're probably not also going to bring back another 20 buckets to take a bath. People did do the best they could. They tried to take baths whenever they could, but it's just not going to be practical to do as often as we would like in the modern world. Also, these cities were crowded and they would have people living very close together. This is the city of Carcassonne in France, and they built a wall around the outside of the town, keeping everybody inside the town for their own sake, for safety. But this also means that you're keeping the animals and the germs and everything else inside as well. So Europe had a few things that were particularly special to them on top of the fact that they had animals, like the rest of the old world. This brings us to the violence part. And maybe you might be tempted to say the Europeans were violent because they all smelled bad and were living close together. But the real answer is feudalism. Once the Roman Empire fell apart, way back, there was no effective government across all of Europe. And so each town was pretty much on its own. And they made their own police and their own guards and their own professional armies. And as each town built up their own professional fighters, they would hire these fighters to defend them against other towns. However, this led to generations of feuding. One group of knights from one town attack the knights from the other town and then take some of their stuff. And then the next generation, that town has revenge on the first town. And so town A attacks town B, and then town B attacks town A. And in the meanwhile, back and forth, they develop better and better weapons, better and better armor, and better fortresses. So you have towns like this one down here, where you have castles and walls of protection. You have the knight's armor getting more and more and more protective as time goes by. As the fights get more violent, the knights spend more time training to get better and better at killing each other. And we like to think about this as a romantic time period of knights with chivalry and stuff like that, but really it was just a very violent period of time where if your town or your kingdom had better, stronger knights than all the other towns and kingdoms, you could just go around and take everybody else's stuff. And so Europeans believed that some people were better than others. If you were stronger, you're better. And so you deserve to take their stuff. So this leads us to the idea of Europeans being violent against outsiders. Why were Europeans so violent against outsiders? And the answer is partially because of the violence that they had against each other. And then the church, because virtually everyone in Europe at this time was Christian, the church and the priests and the pope started to get concerned about how violent everybody was in Europe and wanted to find a way to send that violence somewhere else. So the pope and his priests decided, we're going to go on a crusade. And instead of the knights killing each other in, let's say, France, like they've been doing for 500 years, we're going to send them out to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, to the Middle East. And when they get there, they're going to kill the Muslims and the Jews in the name of Jesus. And lots of people did this. Knights went from Europe all the way over to Jerusalem, to the Middle East, and they killed and slaughtered and pillaged and raped and murdered and everything. And part of the way that the church was able to get people to do this is they said, look, knights, we know you guys are a bunch of sinners. You kill people for your job, and killing is bad. It's against the 10 Commandments or whatever. Do you still want to go to heaven? Yes, of course you do. So here's what you do. Kill Jewish people, and you go straight to heaven. Kill Muslim people, and you go straight to heaven. Automatically. Boom. Europeans were violent against outsiders because they believed that the outsiders were sinners, were working for the devil, but they also had this belief from their generations of violence that if you couldn't beat them up, they had the right to beat you up. And so when they encountered relatively peaceful societies, Jews and Muslims in some of these towns that were just peaceful, regular people, the knights who were crusaders thought, since I can beat you up, I should, and because I did, I was justified. This brings us to our last idea. How did those crusades change European cultures? Well, you might think it made them less violent, but that is wrong. They stayed very violent. Instead, it just changed their life. So they continued to be violent, but they got nicer clothes. They got better food. The Crusaders left Europe, let's say France, for example, and went all the way over to the Middle East to kill people in Jerusalem. And when they got there, they discovered this tasty plant, sugarcane. So this map shows us cultivation of sugarcane. Before Islam, it was mostly over here in India. Then the Muslims spread it all over these areas that are in green. So from 700 to 1500, the Muslims grew sugar in all these places. And the Crusaders during that time would have come over here and they would have tasted sugar from sugarcane, and they loved it. They also would have tasted all of these kinds of spices, things like cinnamon or cloves that would come from places over here in the Indian Ocean. This is going to change their food forever. Before this, European food was relatively bland. Their main spices were things like garlic, onions, and salt. But now you can add to that sugar and cinnamon and cloves and all of these other spices. The other thing that the Crusaders brought back with them was fabric and jewelry and all kinds of like what we would think of as designer goods. This changed their life because it made their houses fancier. They got fancy silk tapestries and brocades and things to put on their chairs and clothing that's made out of fancy fabrics. And they got more gold and jewelry and things like that that would come back from the Middle East to Europe. And then they would reconfigure it into a European style and make themselves feel super fancy. That concludes the 5 slides. In order, the questions were, why was the old world so full of diseases? Why was Europe especially full of diseases? Why were Europeans so violent against each other? Why were Europeans so violent against outsiders? And lastly, how did the Crusades change European culture? You're going to finish your summary sentence for each of these and submit it to Atlantic World Slides Summary classwork. And that is due at 8 a.m. the day of our next class.